Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher. And yesterday we looked at the threat mechanic and its legacy throughout the game in response to the many questions I've had over many years regarding threats and how it's changed and developed and all that kind of stuff. But the good thing about this is that it inspires those of you who want to have a conversation. And I love you guys. You're like my absolute key guys. I love you guys because I want to nerd out about WoW. So in response to this, it wasn't like a fun, jolly, jovial video like one of the legacies, which can inspire all sorts of fun and interesting conversations. This one is more about like, okay, what about this? What about this? What about that? So when I do these type of videos, I think it's a good idea that we have a bit of a Q&A. And I'll do it sort of the day after, so it's not like I'm going to come back months later, because we'll no doubt have a ton of content out by then, and it'll run its course. So, at the time of recording this, these are the kind of questions that have been popping up, and I think we can clear up some things, because it's either a case of a mismemory, maybe I've misremembered something, or anything like that, and all those kind of discussions. So we'll go on there. So we'll start with the obvious one, which was basically posted by T-Law, which is, wait, threat isn't the same? You know what I mean? I've been a healer for too damn long. No, threat is very, very different, but it did promote a lot of questions about whether threat still really exists. In the minds of many, no, it doesn't exist as a thing anymore. You don't have to do much of anything. Occasionally, you will lose aggro. Someone mentioned the soul capacitor proc going off, which if you've done an unbelievable pull, you've had your legendary ring up, all that kind of thing, and then sometimes your tank's a little bit on the bad side, which it has to be said. You shouldn't be gaining aggro even with a huge, enormous burst like the soul capacitor, because soul capacitor looks, especially on the damage meter, it looks like a huge amount of damage, but remember, a lot of that damage is actually damage you would do anyway. It's not like that threat has just gone and disappeared into the ether. That doesn't exist. So while soul capacitor was procced, you remember you just weren't causing threat until the detonation, but your tank still should have been playing. So that should be the answer to that, is that now that's generally a slack tank. Edward, I hope I'm pronouncing your names correctly here. The other part about managing threat as DPS isn't really that fun either. Probably the most fun part about DPSing is when you go all in with oil cooldowns and you see the mobs melting and your name rising in the meters. Being told to take a 10-second break in between every Shadow Bolt cast isn't really fun anymore, and I don't think it will fit the game anymore. Now, one thing I do agree on is I don't think it fits the game anymore. No, it doesn't. And returning to that kind of play would be extremely difficult to accommodate the player base. They would just be struggling endlessly. But there's a really interesting discussion, and it probably promotes its own video, as it ties into mana as well, is the idea that holding back is just boring. That's not entirely true, and that's why I always mentioned in the video, is like, some will see this as a good thing, and some will see this as a bad thing. And it's what created such huge damage discrepancies, that, as I pointed out the Nylon one, but that was very, very often the case across multiple bosses, that sometimes you would just see people who are equally geared but miles ahead, and that people were like wrapping their heads around, I don't know how to do this. A great example, and I wish I could find the video, I've actually paid, I know, don't shoot me, for a Warcraft movie subscription because it's on the premium archive, is an old friend of mine called Shmi. Shmi was a warlock in the guild Celebrity. They were like world's 7th Illidan, a guild I was desperately trying to be a part of at the time because I was hungry to get up to the world status. He was a warlock. And Void Reaver, his video on Void Reaver is particularly fantastic because it taught me the value of, yes, this is an easy boss, right? Void Reaver was a boss in Tempest Keep. It was considered the easiest boss, generally the first boss you went and killed, as essentially it just died. And it had a threat mechanic where it would knock back the tanks all the time, and this was really the problem because it would knock back the tanks, reduce their threat, and what you had to hope is that, one, they would knock back the current tank, he would lose aggro, and then the second tank should be secondary aggro because the boss wasn't tauntable, and then they would keep swapping in that manner. This meant that a lot of DPS had to keep below the second tank, right? So you'd have your threat meter open, and you were trying to DPS to the point where you would stay below the second tank after each knockback because the tank swap was inevitably coming, which kind of dragged the fight out. But then I watched this video by Shmi, and every video I'd seen since then, everyone was pretty even on the DPS. I saw this video by Shmi, and Shmi was about double the damage of everybody else in the raid. And I was like, what the fuck's going on here? And he showed me the video, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. This is curious, and this started to open my eyes to the possibilities of really pushing yourself as a DPSer. Because a DPSer should be hungry even on the most banal of fights. So what he was doing was, he was presented with a challenge. Now, a challenge on this fight is threat, for example. And each fight, even to modern day, presents its own challenges to get maximum damage output, right? Nothing new there. So his theory was, or the thought he went into the fight with, my challenge here is threat. I have Soul Shatter, reduces my threat by 50%. And I need to figure a way to make this work to my advantage, because that will then put me over everybody else. We're all equally geared, but I think I can manage this fight in a way that's pretty interesting, because one, I'm a warlock, so what I can do here is something that's really cheesy. I know this is horrible, but a lot of people used it at the time. It's called Ride the Lightning. Ride the Lightning was being aware of things like 130% threat in order to actually pull aggro, and how you could then manage that into your threat meter to make decisions about when to actually cast the Soul Shatter. So Soul Shatter was your big threat reduction, but you wanted to obviously use, I think, 2 Soul Shatters in the fight. So like today, where we base things on ideas of trinkets and when they were going to go off, and when your cooldowns are like 3-minute cooldowns, how long is the fight, how many times can I use this cooldown, and can I delay it? So I've done a whole video on that thought process, and a lot of you picked up on that. The same then would apply to not only your DPS cooldown, so that part of the game still remained, as it does today, but you also had this thing about your threat cooldowns. How many times can I use Soul Shatter? So it'd be twice. Now, in order to build this into the fight and make sure I get proper use out of it, I want to use these Soul Shatters effectively. And I now have a decision to make. What if I purposely die? Because purposely dying actually wipes me completely off the threat meter. That's kind of interesting. Because then I have to make the decision. Is it better to die and resurrect myself, to wipe myself off the threat meter, and be a weaker character, but I have opened the door for constant threat, and I never have to worry about threat again in this fight, because I've prolonged the fight long enough that maybe I'll catch up again, because threat was so bad, and my DPS is so high. But if I time this right, what I can do is something like Soul Shatter, die, resurrect, and Soul Shatter again, or maybe go Soul Shatter, die, and do all these kind of things in management. And what you then saw when players started to think in that mindset is, oh, it's actually better for me to die here, wipe my threat, and actually increase my DPS, and now I can actually do some interesting things with that. I mentioned mana earlier. Mana made things more interesting as well, because you could go It was one of the advantages of Melee at the time, was actually their sustainability, because whether or not you realize it, casters didn't really have the mana to, say, let's take a mage, to cast Fireball throughout the duration of a fight. You couldn't do that. You would run out of mana, right? You would have to use proper management with the mana gems at the time and try and work that in. But ultimately, if you just casted Fireball constantly, particularly around vanilla period of time, you would run out of mana. Now, that sounds shitty to many of you. I'm sure that sounds really shitty. It's like, I can't cast Fireball. No, but you then had the option of Scorch. Scorch does less damage, but is more mana efficient. And then you're like, Scorch? What the fuck are you talking about, Preacher? What this then allowed you to do was add another layer of your gameplay. Okay, and this is where it gets interesting. It's not interesting for those of you who just want to go as hard as you possibly can all the time, but I have to say, there's a definite argument to be had that we go all out every single time in every single fight we play. Right? That's like the standard now. When we start mixing in different things, it opens your eyes to different ideas about how to play the game. So let's say we have a fight like Huhuran. Huhuran, if you don't know, had an enrage at 30%, where you had to burn her down. In TBC, a fight was very similar to this, which was Prince Malchezaar. Prince Malchezaar had a phase in the center of the fight where he would become dual wield. This could crush your tank. And obviously you wanted to transition out of that phase, and similar with Huhuran, you wanted to kill her as quickly as possible. So this meant you had to make decisions as a DPSer, especially a caster at the time who had mana issues. It's better, in order for me to actually kill this fight mechanically, I have to think about a couple of things. One, I need to be able to cast my most powerful spells during the enrage period, right, which is Fireball. So I need to have the mana to sustain that amount of the fight. How long is that part of the fight? Okay, I need to think about that. I need to know how much mana I'm going to need for this part of the fight. And then it allows me to think about how much mana can I use before we reach this point of the fight. Do I need to save a mana gem for this? Maybe if I push a little bit more here, then maybe I can mix in a mana gem there. This means I need to cast Scorches at a certain point to manage my mana, similar to how an Arcane Mage might consider his mana manageable. Sort of back in the day, not really now, but a similar sort of idea. And that then makes things more interesting. I would say that it's certainly more interesting. Is it more fun? That's an entirely subjective opinion. Entirely subjective. But then you have this idea of pre-planning your fight more than just what we have now, which is the DPS cooldowns. Because remember, that still exists, you know what I mean? That's not gone away since vanilla. You still were planning when to use your DPS cooldowns. Obviously, in Enrage, everybody should have their DPS cooldowns. That has never changed. So then you have this idea of, like, I'm managing my mana, I'm still doing DPS, but ultimately what I need to do, and maybe even to actually rank on this fight, if you want to look at it in that terms, is then go ahead and make sure I'm ready for this big point in the fight where we can go absolutely ham, and that's going to allow us to score the kill. I personally think that is kind of an interesting way of playing, Would it be applicable now? Probably not, right? But another thing to mention on that note before we move on to the next point is that if you're having to think about Fireball in this example as being your mega nuke, right? Obviously, Instant Pyroblast still existed. But if you had to think of Fireball like that, but you can't use it all the time because of mana constraints, it actually gives more weight and more effect to casting Fireball. It makes Fireball more interesting by default because this is my bit. Now I'm turning up the fucking heat. Now I've put on the minigun. Previously I was using my assault rifle, but now it's minigun time where I'm going to actually pull out the Fireball. And now because Fireball is kind of constrained in my gameplay, it actually makes Fireball more impactful. It makes it more interesting. And it makes you feel, as a player, like now you're putting on the fucking pressure because now I'm going to just smash you with fireballs where previously I really couldn't, but now I'm going for it. So I think that's something interesting that we could all consider there. From Salvadorable. I also enjoyed having to manage my threat. It had a dynamic that was fun for me. It helped me feel more involved and more like I needed to pay attention to what I was doing other than standing in the proverbial fire. Proverbial fire. And we had the ability in Trinket Box back then too, so not sure if they replaced it since it added complexity in managing threat, what brought to the game. Yeah, that's similar to what we said earlier. There's a complexity that gets added to the game that's interesting. Very difficult to explain it to anybody who never was part of that time. And plus, if you're an average player, and I think this is important, is that as you're learning the game, you probably would run into the scenarios where you would often just cast your fireballs and then say, ooh, I'm famously I even have the video of this in Morrigan Tidewalker is our elemental shaman, who was quite literally, he was a nice guy, but he was brought to the raid so he could give us Totem of Wrath, which was an elemental only totem at the time, ran out of mana, and famously one of the mages in the group, who I was a warlock at the time, one of the mages in the group actually responded by saying, I'd rather you not DPS as long as you give us Totem of Wrath because it's just better for the raid. It's kind of an interesting idea, and I think it's something that definitely needs to be looked at. Moving on. I personally think bringing back Threat would add a little more spiced PvE. I don't care too much for the current playstyle where you run in with your dick out and just slap the boss until it dies. Having a mechanic that you need to constantly watch or you'll get reamed. Reamed interests me greatly. Then again, I was 13 back in TBC, so I didn't raid much, so perhaps the threat system isn't as glorious as it currently sounds to me. I made the point that it hinders more than it helps, and this seems to have been directed through the other comments on the video, is that has been directed heavily at those who are bad gamers. That's not what I was saying. I think that's important to clarify here. That's not what I was saying. It actually hinders you. It hinders you as well, which is the important point. Not only does it hinder bad players, or learning players, or whatever you want to say, not only does it hinder those guys because, one, they're generating less threat, and the DPSs are doing less, but still maybe thinking they're good because they're pushing the DPS, or blah, 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 blah. It hinders those, but an important point that I did bring up a couple of times is that as soon as you step out of a raid, this is assuming threat was balanced, say, to TBC or vanilla levels, as soon as you stepped out of a raid, you couldn't perform. It's actually better for you that other people do way more threat. And that's in terms of content that is outside of raiding. Because as much as a lot of us like raiding, we only do that for probably a small proportion of our time, depending on how you play. Some people do that like 100%, raid, log out, that's fine. But if you do take part in any other content in the game, it actually hinders you greatly. Because the likelihood is, if you're doing any sort of pickup mechanic, or random mechanic with random people, or some sort of content in the game where you're not dealing with specifically your guild tanks, or perhaps those brave DPS who respect tank for you on occasion, who are equally geared, if you're not dealing with those players, you are completely held back. And that's why I don't think threat should make a return. Every time you gained power, and I said this piece by piece in the video, every time you gained power, you were one step further away from being able to actively take part in other content. It actually made the game worse for you. I brought up the time when I would cast an Immolate, and I would gain aggro. Because my Immolate on my Warlock was just so powerful that the average tank, who might have been a great player for all I know, it doesn't make a difference, but his gear was so weak, therefore his threat output was so weak, even if he was trying his hardest, just could not contend with the power of my Immolate, let alone an Incinerate or a Shadow Bolt, depending on what spec I was playing at the time. And therefore, it made the game just way less fun for you. As I said, would I personally like it back? Yes, because as somebody who tends to play endgame and never be that guy who's undergeared, that never really tends to happen to me, then it's cool, because the good thing about Threat is that once you were in that high-end field, or you were in an appropriate field for your gear level, you would actively be able to compare yourself against other tanks, something we can't really do anymore. There's no real measure of tank versus tank. And TPS, or threat per second, was a wonderful way of doing that. It was actually a significant part of my application process to Kill Count Lost. Once I actually bit the bullet and stepped my game up to go into the top leagues, one of the first questions I was asked by their main tank when he was looking for a partner to tank with was, what is your TPS? And the reason for that is, look, this is what our DPS puts out. If you turn up and you're doing, saying, 1k TPS, which would be considered kind of average to mid-high, then that's unacceptable to us. We just can't carry that kind of weight. Our DPS would have to hold back too much. We're used to a certain style of playing, and I need to know your TPS. And from that, you could also gauge if your tank applicant was actually a lying motherfucker or not. Because let's say your tank applicant, let's say it was early Black Temple, and you had a tank application, some guy, say, be fresh off the boat out of tier 5, he's killed Vash, he's killed Tempest Keep, he's maybe done a bit of High Jarl, a bit of Black Temple, and he comes to you and he says, I do something like 2.5k TPS. You would go, no you don't. No you don't. And you would just say, well, you're a failed applicant because you're clearly lying, and or you don't monitor these kind of things, or you're just full of shit. All this kind of stuff is just like, you're full of shit. Maybe you hit 2.5k on burst with Wind Fury procs and stuff, yeah, we've all done that every now and again, but sustained? No you don't. No, you don't. Just shut the fuck up. Go and stand outside. And these were the kind of numbers that I showed the Terran Gorfine video, but after that, we then started to get active communities of tanks, especially on Terran Gorfine, who were looking for interesting ways to push their TPS. So we had famous names that some of you might have heard of, like Zavistraz. Zav would come up with all sorts of interesting builds in order to push his TPS. This was a great way of playing, because you often wouldn't die on Terran Gorfine at that point. I came up with a really interesting one, which got picked up by a lot of people, which was to abuse shield block value. Not that many of you will probably remember that, but it essentially made your shield slams outrageous with 2-part tier 5 and a specific trinket and all this kind of stuff to plus your shield block value, which then made your threat absolutely astronomical. And you would post, there would then be forums, like Elitist Jerks would do this quite regularly, is posting side-by-side comparisons of what TPS you managed to do. And those were interesting gauges of how good a tank was. Was it helpful to a raid? Did it mean you couldn't kill the boss? No, you were probably at this point doing way more threat than your DPS ever possibly could. But it was fun and interesting, and it was a way of gauging tanks. Very difficult to gauge tanks now, and I think that's the most important thing there. I think that's pretty good. Hero Gamer, I'll just finish up with this one. I find it so threatening. I think if threat was brought back in a minor way, that it would be good. Namely, first blow threat that would make it so that if a DPS pulls in a dungeon, they can't misdirect you. Fucking Hunters, lol, that Wind Fury tribute. Yeah, rip Wind Fury. I just don't see how it's possible to bring threat back. The question is, I think the real question we have to ask here regarding threat is, what level is appropriate? Is it appropriate in the example used in the video, we say we take 2 players and they're both equally geared, they're both playing to their optimal level, is that the tank is just ahead? That's only good in that environment. Outside of that, it's a complete nightmare, because you're often not side by side with people of equal gear. Right? That very rarely happens, and that's where the disparity comes from. You either have an overgeared tank who can literally just AFK, which is kind of similar to how it is now, but if the focus is on threat as it was, as one of the major roles of tanks, then that's not that. It's not that fun. I remember that's one of my big issues with Wrath of the Lich King, which is when I started to drift away from tanking. Is a big part of the fun I was having was taken away from me, which was seeing how I was comparing up against my guys. And if you're so far ahead that it's boring, especially when that's what you've been focusing on for so long, and we remember we still haven't had anything to really shift us away from that mechanic, or to replace that mechanic would be more appropriate, because Blizzard is still yet to come up with something that replaces that threat mechanic for tanks, because it was threat and defensives, right? Those were the 2 things that tanks should focus on. Now it's just defensives, and they've tried, we mentioned Vengeance and Resolve, they tried to come up with interesting ways of doing that, but it ultimately ended in failure. We haven't had that yet. So what if you make it as it is now, or let's say, okay, so there's three options you can do with threat. Either it's side by side, given optimal gear, the tank should be slightly ahead. The other one is that the tank is never, ever ahead, which is the vanilla model. The problem is then, it doesn't matter how good you are, your DPS are always going to have to hold back regardless of whether the boss needs it or not. So, although earlier I talked about the idea is that you're planning for this big nuke fest, right, to fit in with both your mana pool and your threat, that's only good. That's only good if it's kind of an occasional thing that you have to think about. Because you're going to have to put so much damage into the boss at this point that you need to create a threat gap so you can then be actively chasing after the tank, and that's fine. But you don't want that all the time. You don't want literally every fight, which is vanilla style, where you have to hold back at some point. At some point, you're like, I cannot explore my damage dealer's true potential. And again, I mentioned this is why Patchwork was so popular. It was the only fight, besides maybe Lower Theb, where you could actually see what your character was capable of. And I don't believe it's good that you have to have such few occasions where you can see just how much potential your character has, right? That sounds fucking wank. And so, yeah, we don't really want that either. I think that would be pretty shit. And then we have the third model, which is the tanks just do way more threat. And ultimately, that's the biggest benefit for everybody in nearly every scenario. It really is, when you think about it. If someone was to ask me, probably before I even made the video, my instant answer would be, yeah, I want threat back, because I loved it. I loved all the aspects that I talked about in this video. But given the huge amount of players, and given the different scenarios that I find myself in, and then given those memories of where I literally couldn't do anything because of threats and the limitations that imposed on me, regardless of how I played, it's just not beneficial. Side-by-side sort of synergetic threat, that works just in your raid environment and then gets blown to fuck as soon as you get out of it. Tanks never being able to do that has the problems of DPS never reaching their potential outside of gimmick fights. And the other alternative is what suits most people. And I think ultimately, the real answer is, sometimes we all have to do an LFD or whatever, is I think you would rather have a bad tank that still holds aggro than constantly have tanks that you just can't DPS against. I think you would hate that so much more. And we have to look at it for that rose-tinted point of view. All right, guys, thank you so much for the great feedback. I truly appreciate it. That was awesome. I just love sitting down and kicking back and talking shit about all this kind of stuff, because it's interesting. It's interesting towards game design as anything. You know what I mean? It's really sort of congruent to my interests anyway. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.